At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. Of all the ways Command Sergeant Carter Holt imagined meeting his end, bored to death by a slide presentation was rapidly ascending the list with a bullet. The amphitheater was a monument to hegemon sterility, gracefully arcing tiers of pearl-white seating, holographic projectors that hummed with a placid, non-threatening energy, and a single panoramic window framing the silent clockwork waltz of the Axiom Citadel. It was an institution built on the unshakable conviction that a sufficiently nuanced argument could deflect a plasma bolt. Carter's entire blood-soaked career was a testament to the contrary. He'd idly mapped the room's tactical vulnerabilities: too many panoramic windows, a severe deficit of defensible exits. It was a death trap designed by committee. Professor Valen, a Kalian so elongated and slender he looked as though a strong breeze might fold him into a piece of abstract origami, drifted across the stage. His voice was like polished river stones tumbling in a slow stream, each word perfectly smooth and rounded, perfectly calibrated to deliver condescending truths. He gestured a long, three-jointed finger toward a holographic display. The image resolved into a grainy, monochrome photograph of human soldiers, haggard and mud-caked, huddled in a trench that looked like a fresh grave. "Observe," Valen intoned, his voice resonating softly in the cavernous space. "The fundamental paradox of human strategic doctrine. A philosophy built on enduring storms rather than commanding the lightning. Their history reads less as a chronicle of conquest and more as a litany of survival, purchased at a catastrophic, almost spiritual cost." In the back row, Carter shifted uncomfortably in the stiff, dove-gray uniform of a military liaison for interspecies strategic studies. The title was a masterpiece of bureaucratic camouflage, a cover so profoundly dull it functioned as a cloaking device. It was designed for a man intended to be overlooked. His internal monologue, however, was a low, steady grumble. "Survival beats extinction, Professor. You can etch that on the tomb of the Grendel Fifth war host." He scanned the cadets arrayed below. A young Lorian female, Kita, scribbled furiously on her datapad, her feathery antennae twitching with concentration. Beside her, a hulking Jotun named Brog sat with his spine locked so straight he could have been used as a surveyor's plumbline, his dense, stony features a mask of dutiful attention. They were good kids, bright-eyed and earnest, absorbing elegant theories that would get them eviscerated in the first 10 seconds of a real war. A familiar acid began to bubble in Carter's gut, the burn of a soldier being forced to listen to a politician explain the nuances of a knife fight. The sensation intensified as Valen glided to his grand finale, the intellectual cornerstone he believed was the ultimate proof of his thesis. The holo display flickered, replacing the trench with a modern, high-resolution image, the shattered skeletal remains of a spaceport on a world called Viridia. "Even their most celebrated moments," Valen continued, his voice adopting a somber, almost theatrical reverence, "such as the selfless stand during the Viridia Exodus, are framed as glorious deaths. The hegemony peacekeepers brokered a ceasefire, allowing for civilian withdrawal. Yet the human Black Ops cell, in a display of their characteristic refusal to yield, declined to stand down. They fought until no one was left." He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle over the hall. "Their triumphs are merely the postponement of annihilation, achieved at a cost no rational species would deem acceptable." That was it, the polished intellectual lie that grated against the scar tissue on his soul. A lie his friends had irrigated with their own blood. A lie he had carried in silence for 2 agonizing years. He couldn't stay quiet. Not this time. Carter's hand went up. It was a solid, unignorable presence in the shadowed back of the hall, a monolith of dissent in a sea of academic conformity. Professor Valen's lecture hall rhythm, honed over a century of unchallenged discourse, fractured. He peered into the shadowed upper tiers, his large, liquid dark eyes blinking slowly, conveying a profound annoyance at the interruption. A human, naturally. The liaison. They were always so emphatic. "Do you have a counterpoint, Command Sergeant Halt?" Valen inquired. The title was a formal courtesy, but his tone was lacquered with the kind of intellectual disdain that only a tenured academic who'd never had his theories shot at could truly muster. It was the voice of a man who hadn't been genuinely challenged since his own post-larval stage. Carter stood. His frame was compact, unimposing by galactic standards, especially next to titans like Brog. But he moved with a coiled gravitational density that pulled the attention of the room toward him. The polite, scholarly murmuring in the amphitheater evaporated. Every eye, from the front-row prodigies to the sleepy upper-year students, was fixed on him. "With all due respect, Professor," Carter's voice was even, but it cut through the hall's acoustics with the flat, penetrating crack of a railgun slug. "You're wrong." A soft, collective intake of breath whispered through the cadets. One did not, under any circumstances, inform Professor Valen that he was wrong. It was a violation of the established order of the universe, akin to telling a black hole it was having a bad hair day. Valen's ready frame went rigid, his placid expression tightening into something brittle. "Wrong?" Valen repeated, the word tasting like spoiled nectar in his mouth. "On what grounds, Sergeant? Historical precedent? Strategic analysis? Please do enlighten us all." Carter offered no verbal response. He reached up with one hand and unfastened the magnetic clasp at the collar of his drab, gray liaison uniform. With the softest hiss of parting fabric, the front of the jacket fell open. Underneath, he wore a simple, black, moisture-wicking undershirt, the standard issue for the Human Confederacy Marine Corps. Pinned to the dark fabric, just over his heart, was a silent, irrefutable counter-argument. A row of decorations, stark and brilliant against the muted material, each one a tombstone for a different version of himself. Carter pointed a scarred, calloused finger to the highest medal, a multi-pointed star of polished tungsten and captured starlight. "Confederacy Star of Valor," he said, his voice a hammer striking an anvil. "Awarded for actions during the Hades Maw Anomaly Campaign. Sir, Earth always wins." His finger moved down one notch. "Hegemony Cluster for extreme gallantry. I received that for pulling your ambassador's offspring out of a burning shuttle on Tartarus." Then his finger came to rest on a smaller, simpler medal at the end of the row. It was a plain metallic disc, banded with a strip of deep crimson fabric. It lacked the ornate design of the others, but it seemed to possess a greater mass, a gravity that bent the light around it. "And this one," Carter said, his gaze locking with Valen's across the vast expanse of the hall. "You might recognize it. The Crimson Bar of Viridia, a civilian honor your own provisional government awarded, posthumously, to the members of Human Special Operations Unit 9 who held the south gate at the evacuation spaceport." A tremor, visible even from the back of the hall, ran through Professor Valen's slender frame. He knew that medal. He had been on the committee that designed it. His own daughter, Karis, had been on one of the last transports out of that burning city, her life purchased by the very men he had just reduced to a lecture point on irrationality. Carter let the quiet stretch, letting it become a heavy, suffocating blanket. He allowed every cadet, allowed Valen himself to connect the terrible, unspoken dots. Then he delivered the final, devastating sentence, his voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper that sliced through the amphitheater like a shard of obsidian. "Sir, I was there." He pulled the gray jacket fully open, revealing the rest of the decorations, a silent, damning mosaic of a dozen different hells scattered across the galaxy. "And sir," he finished, his eyes boring into the professor's, "we held the line." The statement detonated in the quiet hall, an act of intellectual insurrection against the Citadel's entire founding philosophy. The air in the room became a solid thing, heavy and sharp in the lungs, a silent scream in the tranquil heart of the galaxy's most peaceful institution. Carter was back in his Spartan quarters, the angry buzzing pings from the Citadel administration on his personal comm unit going studiously ignored. The confrontation had flayed him raw, leaving him exposed and bone-weary. He'd torched his cover, shattered every regulation in his mission brief, and likely launched his entire career into a decaying orbit, all for a truth nobody here had any interest in hearing. He sat on the edge of his perfectly made bunk and called up a secure star chart on his datapad. He traced the unassuming patrol vector of a single freighter icon moving through the contested space along the Grendel border. The TCS Nightjar, a Q ship, a shark in a dolphin costume. Its steady, predictable path was a small, cold comfort in a universe of variables. From a hidden compartment in the base of his footlocker, he retrieved a small hardened device the size of his thumb. It was dense, fashioned from a matte black alloy that seemed to drink the light and was cold to the touch. The Harrowlight beacon, his dead man's switch. He thumbed the diagnostic stud. A single tiny green LED blinked once. Power cell 100%. A grim necessity. A prayer he'd hoped he'd never have to voice. Activating it wasn't a call for help. It was a scream for apocalyptic retribution. As he slid the beacon back into its hiding place, a flicker of light outside his window snagged his attention. This was no gentle pulse of a ship entering orbit. This was a silent, brilliant flash, like a star being born and dying in the same instant. Then another, farther out in the black, and a third. The Citadel's orbital defense platforms, the pride of the hegemony fleet, were blossoming into short-lived incandescent flowers of destruction. The sky broke. Before the thunder of the explosions could violate the atmosphere, a sound Carter knew with an intimate soul-deep dread blared across the campus. The piercing, gut-wrenching shriek of a red alert siren. It was the sound that signaled the end of all debate. He looked out the window again. Flying hatchets of dark metal, Grendel dropships, were screaming through the upper atmosphere, their hulls glowing like embers with re-entry heat. They were executing a direct decapitation strike. This was no random act of piracy. The Grendel wanted the Citadel itself, home to the hegemony's central strategic archives and the nursery for its future admiralty. They were here to strangle the next generation of leadership in the cradle before the war even truly began. Carter was moving before the sirens reached their shrieking peak. The board liaison persona was gone, vaporized in an instant. The command sergeant was in absolute control. Go bag from under the bunk. Inside, a compact kinetic sidearm, an item whose presence on campus constituted a capital offense, 3 spare power cells, a multi-tool, and a trauma kit. He clipped the Harrowlight beacon to the inside of his belt, a hard, reassuring weight against his hip. Every action was a fluid economy of motion, honed by 1,000 missions that never made it into the history books. He burst out into the main residential corridor and slammed into a wall of pure, unadulterated pandemonium. Cadets, the best and brightest from a dozen species, the future admirals and strategists of the hegemony, were screaming, crying, and running in every direction, their only objective a blind, terrified flight from the ugly reality that had just crashed their tea party. Through the massive archway leading to the central quad, he saw them. Grendel's shock troops, clad in heavy brutalist armor the color of dried blood, advancing in disciplined fire teams. Their plasma rifles spat methodical, emerald-green bolts, scything down fleeing students and faculty with a cold, impersonal fatality. Carter's mind processed it all in a sliver of a second, the chaos slowing into a series of tactical problems. Cover is port and starboard. Open ground is a kill box. Enemy advancing from Vector 090. Then he saw him, Professor Valen, standing frozen in the middle of the corridor, staring at the carnage with the profound, shattering disbelief of a man whose entire worldview was being graphically disemboweled before his eyes. A Grendel fire team, 4 soldiers, rounded the far corner of the corridor, raising their rifles. Valen was directly in their line of fire. So were a handful of other cadets huddled behind him, among them the Lorian Kitta and the Jotun Brog. There was no time to shout a warning. Carter broke into a dead sprint. He lowered his shoulder and executed a textbook combat tackle, driving it hard into Valen's willowy midsection. The impact was jarring, a crunch of bone against muscle, but Carter used their combined momentum, a messy, sprawling cannonball of bodies, to shove the entire group, Valen, Kitta, and Brog, and two other terrified cadets, into an open passage, a service corridor they had just stampeded past. A fraction of a second later, a volley of plasma bolts slammed into the wall where they had been standing, vaporizing the decorative paneling and leaving a series of hissing molten craters. The corridor filled with the sharp metallic scent of superheated ceramic and sterilized air. Pinned under Carter, Valen gasped for breath, his academic dignity a forgotten casualty. Kita whimpered, her datapad clutched to her chest like a holy text. Brog was on his hands and knees, stunned into immobility. Carter pushed himself up, his voice a drill sergeant's bark that sliced through their fear like a shockwave. "With me, now! Move!" Carter herded his terrified, impromptu squad through the winding service corridors. The pristine elegance of the Citadel was a memory, replaced by a labyrinth of pipes, conduits, and humming machinery. The distant percussive sounds of plasma fire and the thin, sharp screams of the dying were their only landmarks. He needed a defensible position, a place to reset. "In here!" he grunted, shoving open a heavy door marked Commons Galley, authorized personnel only. They spilled into a vast, silent kitchen. Gleaming stainless steel surfaces and rows of silent food synthesizers reflected the flashing red emergency lights. The room was empty, for now. Heavy rhythmic footsteps echoed from the corridor they'd just abandoned, a Grendel patrol sweeping and clearing. "Footlocker, now!" Carter commanded, pointing to a large walk-in refrigeration unit. The others scrambled inside without question, their academic minds now completely subservient to his survival instinct. He was about to follow when his eyes landed on a stack of large metallic cafeteria trays, each nearly half an inch thick. An idea, born of pure desperation and battlefield experience, sparked in his mind. He grabbed one. It was heavy, unwieldy, perfect. He flattened himself against the wall beside the doorway, the tray held up like some primitive riot shield. The footsteps grew louder. The first Grendel soldier stepped through the entrance, rifle held at the ready, its optical sensor sweeping the room. Carter moved. The soldier's reaction was instantaneous. The plasma rifle came up, spitting a bolt of incandescent green energy. Carter didn't try to block it head-on. That would be suicide. He angled the heavy slab of metal, turning his body with the motion, letting physics do the work. The plasma bolt struck the tray with a deafening crack, hiss. It deflected, not absorbed, gouging a molten white trench across the metal's surface and slamming into a food synthesizer behind Carter, which promptly exploded into a shower of sparks and nutrient paste. The kinetic shock of the impact was brutal, a violent, numbing jolt that shot up his arm like being hit by a freight train. The tray, now glowing a warped cherry red along the impact groove, was almost too hot to hold. But it had worked. For a fatal half-second, the Grendel soldier was frozen, its combat-honed brain trying to process why the seemingly unarmored human hadn't just been slagged. It was half a second too long. Carter closed the distance in 2 quick strides. He didn't use the flat of the tray. He used the edge, the part that was now searing hot. He slammed it, hard, into the side of the soldier's helmet. There was a sickening crunch of plasteel and a muffled, wet cry. The soldier dropped like a sack of stones. Carter grabbed the alien's rifle before it hit the floor, spun and put 2 shots into the chest of the second soldier entering the kitchen. Then he rounded the doorframe and neutralized the rest of the 4-man squad in the corridor before they could even register that their point man was dead. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 seconds. From the crack in the food locker door, Brog watched, his wide eyes reflecting the flashing emergency lights. He had been trained in hegemony honor duels and the established articles of engagement. He had never seen anything like this. This wasn't combat as he understood it. This was pest control. It was brutal, ugly, terrifyingly efficient, and utterly devoid of honor. It was the savage reality of a human fighting not for glory, but for the next breath. The metallic confines of the food locker were cold and smelled of fear and chilled synthetic produce. Valen leaned against a rack of protein tubes, his face the color of bleached parchment. Kita was curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. Brog just stared at Carter, who was methodically field-stripping the captured Grendel plasma rifle. The authority he now radiated was absolute, a physical force in the small space. "They'll send more," Carter stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He ejected the rifle's power cell, checked the charge with a practiced eye, and slammed it back into place with a solid thunk. "We can't stay here." Kita, seeing his calm competence, seemed to find an anchor in the storm of her own terror. Her fear coalesced into its opposite, data. Her shaking hands steadied as she powered on her datapad. "The schematics!" she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up blueprints of the Citadel. I memorized them for my advanced engineering elective. The main campus is built on a network of utility tunnels. Power, data, environmental controls. They connect every major building." She looked up at Carter, a spark of desperate, frantic hope in her eyes. "We can move through the entire campus without being seen." A slow, grim, predatory smile spread across Carter's face. It was the smile of a wolf who had just been handed a map of the sheep pen. "All right, kids," he said, his voice a low growl. "School's out. Time for a practical lesson in asymmetric warfare." He looked at Kita. "You're our navigator." Then he turned to Brog. "Brog, you're our battering ram. You move what needs moving and you watch our backs. Any questions?" Brog just shook his massive head, his belief in by-the-book warfare shattering like cheap glass with every passing second. "Good," Carter said, racking the charging handle on the plasma rifle. "Let's move." They descended through a floor grate in the back of the kitchen into another world. The citadel above was a place of light and open spaces. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and oppressive. The air was cold and carried the metallic tang of overworked circuits and the damp, earthy smell of recycled water. A constant, low hum of machinery vibrated through the metal catwalks they moved along. The grimy surface was slick with condensation under Carter's boots, and he had to steady Kita once when she nearly slipped on a patch of leaked coolant. Kita led the way, her face illuminated by the pale blue glow of her datapad. "Left at this junction," she'd whisper, her voice tight with tension. "This conduit leads under the Hall of Diplomacy." Her eidetic memory, once a tool for acing exams, had become their most vital survival tool. Brog followed her, his immense weight making the catwalk groan and vibrate with each heavy tread. He used his raw strength to pry open jammed maintenance corridors that screeched in protest, their rusted hinges complaining at the abuse. The ceiling was low, forcing even Carter to stoop, and the oppressive feeling of tons of ferrocrete and steel above them was a constant weight on their minds. Carter moved between them, a ghost in the shadows. He taught them with simple, clear hand signals he'd learned in the Black Ops division of the Marines. Halt, danger ahead, move up, cover. They were quick studies, their academic intellects now hyper-focused on the new, brutal curriculum of survival. Hours bled into one another. They became creatures of the dark, their world shrinking to the narrow beam of Kita's datapad and the sound of their own breathing. At one point, her device picked up the energy signature of a Grendel heavy patrol moving in the corridor directly above them. Worse, they had thermal sensors. "Down!" Carter hissed, pointing to a large maintenance cistern set into the floor, its surface covered with a slick of oily, brackish water. There was no hesitation. They submerged themselves, the freezing liquid shocking the air from their lungs. They huddled together in the dark, icy water, listening to the heavy, clanking footsteps pass just feet above their heads. Each step was a hammer blow against their frayed nerves. When the footsteps finally faded, they emerged, shivering, soaked and covered in a foul-smelling grime that clung to their skin. But they were alive. In a small, dry maintenance junction, a dead-end pocket off the main tunnel, Carter finally called a halt. The only sounds were their own ragged breathing and the distant, ever-present hum of the Citadel's life support systems. Kita leaned against a wall, her teeth chattering violently. A long, ugly scrape ran down her forearm from a sharp piece of metal she'd brushed against in the dark. Without a word, Carter knelt, unsealed his go bag, and pulled out the trauma kit. His movements were gentle, surprisingly deft for a man who had just dismantled a squad of enemy soldiers with a piece of kitchenware. "This is going to sting," he said quietly. She flinched as he cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, but she didn't pull away. He applied the biofoam, which hissed softly as it expanded to seal the cut, the cold sensation a strange counterpoint to the fear still coursing through her. Watching them, Brog quietly opened a nutrient paste packet from his own emergency kit. He broke it in two and handed one half to Kita and the other to Carter. Carter looked at the gray, unappetizing packet, then at Brog's stoic, rock-like face, and gave a short, sharp nod of acceptance. It was more than food. It was a sacrament. Valen, who had been huddled in the corner, a silent, ghost-like observer to this brutal education, watched the exchange. He saw the simple acts of care, a bandage, shared food, and understood that something profound was happening. They were no longer a sergeant, two cadets, and a professor. They were a unit, a tiny, desperate family forged in the darkness beneath a battlefield, bound by a shared terror and a common purpose. He felt a pang of shame, realizing he had nothing to offer them but his own useless, abstract knowledge. "There!" Kita whispered, pointing to a schematic on her datapad. They were huddled behind a large power conduit, the air around it humming with contained energy. "That's a primary communications nexus. The Grendel are using it to set up a local command and control repeater. Taking it out would cripple their coordination on this entire side of the campus." Carter peered around the corner. Two Grendel technicians were working on a portable comms array, while three heavily armed guards stood watch, their plasma rifles held in a loose, confident patrol grip. "Kita, your datapad," Carter said, his voice low. "Can it push a localized EMP?" "A small one," she said, her fingers already dancing across the screen. "It won't disable their weapons, which are hardened, but it should overload the visual sensors in their helmet HUDs. It'll blind them for a few seconds." "Brog," Carter looked at the big Jotun. "See that detached wall panel?" He pointed to a large, thick sheet of plasteel leaning against the far wall. "That's your new shield." The plan was simple, brutal, and had no place in a hegemony tactical manual. Carter gave a sharp, downward nod. Kita sent the targeted EMP burst. A low, almost subsonic hum filled the air, and the lights on the Grendel soldiers' helmets flickered and died. In that instant of manufactured chaos, Brog charged. He moved with the improbable speed of a runaway freight train, scooping up the heavy plasteel panel as if it were cardboard. A disoriented guard fired wildly, and the plasma bolt sizzled against the makeshift shield, leaving a glowing orange scar. Brog roared, a sound of pure primal fury, and smashed into the heavy weapons emplacement, sending the comms repeater and one of the technicians flying in a shower of broken parts. Carter was right behind him, the captured plasma rifle spitting green bolts with lethal accuracy. He took out the remaining guards with clean, efficient shots to their chest plates before they could clear their vision. The engagement was over in less than 10 seconds. It was another brutal, ugly piece of work. They secured the extra weapons and the now damaged comms repeater. As a final touch, Carter got a wicked glint in his eye. "Kita, can you hack this thing to broadcast instead of receive?" She nodded, already interfacing her datapad with the captured Grendel tech. "What do you want it to send?" "Something annoying," Carter grunted. A few minutes later, as they slipped back into the tunnels, a looped, distorted, and slightly too fast recording of a Grendel dirge of conquest began blasting on all local enemy channels. It was a petty, psychological irritant, a ghost in their machine designed to fray nerves and sow confusion. A small act of defiance that made them all feel fractionally better. A faint repeating signal had appeared on Kita's datapad, a standard hegemony civilian distress call, weak and intermittent. It was coming from the Grand Archives, a massive, imposing building that housed millennia of knowledge from across the galaxy. "Survivors," Brog rumbled, his voice a low vibration in the cramped tunnel.
We have to help them.
Carter didn't like it. A large group of civilians was a liability, an anchor in a storm. But his own history, the ghosts of Viridia, wouldn't let him leave them. They navigated the final stretch of tunnels and emerged through a ventilation grate into the cavernous, silent library. The air smelled of old parchment and fear. Inside, they found them. Nearly 50 students and faculty huddled together in the dark between towering shelves of data slates. Among them was Professor Valen. As soon as he saw Carter, he pulled him aside, his face etched with a terrible newfound clarity.
After your outburst,
Valen confessed, his voice a ragged whisper,
I felt compelled to verify my sources. I accessed the restricted hegemony military archives.
He held up his datapad. On the screen was the official after-action report for the Viridia Exodus. It listed every member of the Human Special Operations Unit 9, including Command Sergeant Carter Holt as killed in action. Carter's mind flashed back to a darkened room on a covert outpost, a clandestine service colonel handing him a copy of the falsified records, along with a back-channel replacement for the medal he insisted Carter take.
The lie protects us, the colonel had said, his eyes hard. It keeps the wolves from the door. Wear it anyway.
Valen's composure finally snapped. His voice broke.
My daughter, Caris, she was in the last transport off-world. She only made it because the south gate held.
He looked at Carter, his eyes swimming with a toxic mixture of shame and awe. The full weight of his intellectual arrogance, his life's work, came crashing down on him.
They told us you all died buying her life,
Valen whispered, the words tearing at his throat.
And I used your sacrifice as a footnote in a lecture about futility.
Carter looked at the broken academic. He felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a shared understanding of a galaxy that ran on hard truths and convenient, soul-crushing lies.
The first casualty of war is always the truth, Professor,
Carter said, his voice low and hard.
Now let's get you all out of here alive.
Kita worked feverishly over the captured Grendel comms repeater in a small, secure records room deep within the archives. The air hummed with the energy of the device.
I can't break their primary encryption,
she finally reported, frustration sharp in her voice.
It's a military-grade nightmare, but the hardware's powerful. The broadcast amplifier's ridiculously overspec'd. If we could get this unit to a high-gain broadcast point, like the main antenna or the administration spire, I could use brute force. I could slice through the planetary jamming and push a single high-density signal burst into deep space.
She looked at Carter, her eyes wide with the terrifying implication.
I could transmit the Harolite beacon's protocol.
The administration spire, the tallest structure on campus, now undoubtedly the Grendel command post. Brog, who had been standing guard at the door, let out a low rumble.
That's not a mission. That's a suicide run.
Then I'm going alone, Carter stated. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. He picked up the heavy repeater. This was his responsibility, his protocol, his burden to bear.
No.
The word was quiet, but it had the immovable force of a mountain. Carter turned. It was Brog. The big Jotun had taken a step forward, his jaw set like granite.
No, sir,
Brog said again, his deep voice uncharacteristically firm.
In the lecture hall, I was a cadet. In the tunnels, I was a follower. I'm not anymore. You taught us to work as a unit. We finish this as a unit.
Kita stood up, her fear now completely overshadowed by a fierce, defiant loyalty.
He's right. You can't carry the repeater and fight your way to the top alone. It's tactically unsound. You need me to run the broadcast, and you need him to clear the way.
Carter looked at them, at these two kids who had been forged into something new in the crucible of the last few hours. He saw not insubordination, but the birth of soldiers. He felt a swell of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: pride. A new plan was forged in the dusty records room. Brog brought up a new schematic on Kita's datapad, pointing a thick, blunt finger at a series of conduits running beneath the West Quad.
The main fuel line for the Citadel's primary generators,
He explained, his tactical mind, once constrained by textbooks, now operating with ruthless clarity.
A single well-placed plasma charge here could rupture the junction.
A diversion, Carter said, nodding in approval. Then he looked at Brog. And while they're all running to the fire, what about you? Brog traced another line on the schematic.
The fuel line runs parallel to a primary service shaft that terminates 2 levels below the spire's roof. While they go west, I'll go up. I'll be your backup.
It wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a plan, a synthesis of Brog's by-the-book knowledge of the Citadel's infrastructure, Kita's technical genius, and Carter's own brutal, tactical ruthlessness. The West Quad erupted in a roaring, rolling fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the air, turning the alien night into a brief, violent dawn. Alarms blared across the Grendel comms network as their forces scrambled to respond to the sudden, catastrophic explosion. As the bulk of the enemy redeployed, Carter and Kita sprinted from the cover of the archives, heading for the administration spire. The fight was a brutal, vertical ascent. They stormed the lobby, then took to the stairs, bypassing the lockdown lifts.
Stairwell, 2 levels up!
Kita breathed, her eyes glued to the security schematics on her wrist pad, which she'd synced to her datapad.
Ambush position!
Carter didn't break stride. As they rounded the landing, he ricocheted a kinetic round from his sidearm off the far concrete wall. The slug whined and struck the helmet of a Grendel soldier waiting in ambush with a sharp crack. Before the body fell, Carter was already past him, his captured rifle covering the next landing. They moved with a speed and synergy that defied their short time together, a whirlwind of calculated violence. They reached the rooftop access door, a heavy, reinforced plasteel hatch.
30 seconds!
Kita gasped, already fumbling with the bulky repeater.
I'll need at least 30 seconds of clear access once I plug this into the main console.
Before Carter could respond, the access door was blasted inwards, ripped from its hinges by a concentrated plasma charge. Standing in the swirling smoke and dust was Warlord Hakkar, his armor a darker shade of crimson than his troops, his face a mask of cold reptilian fury. Flanking him were 2 of his elite honor guard, their weapons already raised. A brutal close-quarters firefight erupted. Carter shoved Kita behind the main comms console and laid down a desperate stream of covering fire. His plasma rifle overheated, the weapon glowing a dull, angry red. He dropped it and switched to his sidearm.
I need 30 seconds!
Kita screamed, her hands a blur as she frantically tried to connect the repeater's interface cable to the antenna's primary port. Carter took a hit, a plasma bolt grazing his shoulder. The pain was a sharp, white-hot fire that stole his breath. He emptied his sidearm's power cell into one of the guards. Hakkar's remaining guard broke past him and charged directly at the exposed Kita. Suddenly, a maintenance hatch on the side of the roof was kicked open from the inside with a shriek of tortured metal. Brog, covered in soot and grime, hauled his massive frame onto the rooftop, erupting from the service shaft he'd been climbing all along. Without a moment's hesitation, he ripped a server rack door from its hinges and charged, intercepting the Grendel soldier. He took a plasma bolt directly to his armored shoulder with a deep grunt of pain, but his momentum didn't slow. He slammed the makeshift shield into the soldier, a sound like a car crash, sending him tumbling off the side of the spire into the darkness below. With the immediate threat to Kita neutralized, Carter, wounded and bleeding, grabbed a length of the bent antenna wreckage from the ground. It was a clumsy makeshift club, but it was all he had left. He planted himself between Hakkar and his team, a one-man wall of pure, unadulterated grit, ready to face the warlord. Carter was on his knees, his makeshift club bent and twisted, but he refused to fall. His vision was blurring at the edges. Hakkar shoved his last remaining, now hesitant guard aside and leveled his heavy plasma pistol at Carter's head.
Primitive!
Hakkar snarled, his voice a guttural rasp of contempt. Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, Kita screamed from behind the main console, her voice a raw, triumphant cry that cut through the wind and the whine of dying machinery.
It's sent! Signal away! The Harrowlight protocol is away!
The sky above them ripped open. Not with the elegant, silver-prowed ships of the hegemony. These were brutal, shark-like silhouettes, all sharp angles and weapon emplacements, painted in a non-reflective matte black that drank the starlight. Human marine dropships from the TCS Nightjar. From their open bays, figures descended on grav chutes, hell divers encased in black armor that made the Grendel look like ceremonial guards. Their railguns fired with silent, invisible crackles, launching hypersonic tungsten slugs. The slugs tore through the Grendel positions across the campus with terrifying surgical efficiency. Dropships were swatted from the sky like annoying flies. Armored patrols were reduced to molten slag in an instant. There was no honor in the assault. There was no warning. There was only overwhelming, shocking, inhumanly fast human firepower. The battle for the Axiom Citadel was over in 90 seconds. The rooftop was a scene of controlled, professional chaos. A Terran combat medic was patching up Carter, slapping a self-sealing biofoam patch onto his shoulder that hissed as it inflated. Brog was getting similar treatment nearby, looking dazed but immensely proud. Kita was talking excitedly to a Terran comms specialist, pointing at the jury-rigged repeater she had used to save them all. Professor Valen found Carter amidst the wreckage, escorted by a Marine who looked like he could arm-wrestle a small moon and win. The Kalian professor looked from Carter's bloodied, exhausted form to the brutally efficient human Marines securing the area, and back again. His entire universe had been shattered and rebuilt in a single violent day. He stepped closer, his voice a whisper filled with a terrible, profound awe.
My lecture. I said humans don't win wars. I was wrong. You do win.
The medic offered Carter a small, white synth cigarette. Carter took it with a slightly trembling hand. The medic lit it for him with a flick of a thumb lighter. The tip glowed a defiant, steady red in the encroaching twilight. Carter took a long, slow drag, the familiar chemicals beginning to calm the fire in his nerves. He looked at Valen, a man drowning in the wreckage of his own certainty, and saw not an enemy, but just another survivor.
No, Professor, he said, his voice raspy but clear. You were right the first time.
He exhaled a cloud of gray smoke, which the wind snatched away into the night, a fleeting ghost against the star-dusted sky.
We don't win them. We end them.